was a very long bio. I didn't realize I'd sent so much. Apologies for that. Thank you for everyone who came out today. Thank you to the Center for inviting me here. And it's really exciting and an honor to present some ongoing work that I have. And this also happens to be my first official professional lecture presentation, so thank you for letting me check mark that off my bucket list. As a presenter today at the Center, I also want to recognize that here at the university, we sit upon the lands and the territories of the Winnebago, Miami, Sauk, and Mesakawi people. As a scholar of critical sociology, it's important for me to recognize the ongoing impressions and our own complicity within them before I start any work. So I'm excited to present this draft. It initially began as my MA thesis last year. In my research on higher education, I've been trying to understand the inequalities and inequities through a more organizationally minded and historical perspective. By this, I mean I think a lot about the specific ways in which institutions of higher education, through their functioning, fail to ameliorate injustices and inequalities. Scholars who think about race, admissions, and enrollment often get entangled in conversations about meritocratic criteria, which in this day and age usually means academic grades and standardized test scores. The definition of merit has changed over time, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the presentation. But what remains curious is why conversations of meritocracy remain prevalent in policy circles when there's been not much interrogation regarding how these commitments to meritocracy actually look like for an institution that has competing priorities. And that will be the framework that I start my presentation with. This tension led me to consider the framework of the iron triangle of enrollment management. This framework focuses expressly on the enrollment side, so after the application and after the admission portion, to evaluate how competing institutional priorities for tuition, access for underrepresented and historically excluded communities, and pursuit of having a competitive academic profile in their student body, how all of these things come together to play out. In a time when baccalaureate aspirations are ubiquitous and students from all racial and ethnic backgrounds are enrolling in college at higher rates, institutions of higher ed confront strains on their revenue streams due to declining public appropriations. Scholars have studied how institutions' responses to these declines have affected the types of students that they admit and pursue for enrollment. Through the iron triangle of enrollment management framing, institutions have attempted to balance their revenue concerns against the pursuits for access for historically excluded students and the pursuit of a competitive academic profile for their institutional prestige. As I'm sure you're aware, universities care a lot about their rankings, and their rankings are in part determined by the average SAT score, things of that sort, which is why the pursuit of an academic profile among their student body is something that they really care about. Balancing these three competing goals has most recently resulted in shifts away from increasing enrollment of lower income historically underrepresented students, but increases in enrollments of non-resident students who pay higher tuition costs. In pursuing these non-resident students, public institutions in particular have seen decreases in the proportion of lower income students and in historically underrepresented students. These negative effects on access raise the question of whether access is a materially tenable goal in higher education. By that I mean, is it realistic that we keep on saying that we're committed to access and equity as we pursue these other priorities? Scholars have found that the shifting definition of merit and the growing influence of entrance exam scores on admissions, which is the pursuit of academic profile, have resulted in enrolling fewer students from lower income backgrounds and historically excluded students. Though scholars have noted some gains in access, they highlighted that access has come at the cost of equity for these excluded communities. Thus far, the scholarship on academic profile and access has identified the negative relationship between access and pursuit for academic profile. But it has not utilized this framework that I'm going to use for my paper to evaluate the veracity of claims for access as a legitimate and realizable goal in enrollment management. So, while scholars have begun applying this framework to evaluating enrollment trends among public institutions at the institutional level, it has not been applied to setting individual level student enrollments. This paper uses individual level enrollment data from two nationally representative longitudinal data sets to conduct cross-sectional multinomial logistic regressions, for those of you who are familiar with that approach. And what I show is how increasing thresholds for academic profile at elite institutions foreshadow a tenuous situation. The pursuit of an ever-increasing competitive academic profile will make the pursuit of access for historically excluded students an untenable goal, leaving institutional claims for diversification hollow. To be clear, my claim is not that students from historically excluded backgrounds cannot reach the threshold of academic competitiveness. Rather, as my analyses will show you, it is the constellation of pursuing revenue, academic profile, and access that raises my concerns around access being tenable. I go about showing this tenuous relationship through predictive probability modeling of students enrolling at institutions disaggregated by Barron selectivity, rankings in 2004 and 2013. I model how students who are at the 84th, 91st, and 97th national percentiles in terms of academic credentials have differential enrollment odds in terms of where they go to college. I focus these simulations along the dimensions of racialized and socioeconomic backgrounds separately to show how the institutional pursuit of competitive academic profiles plays out for students who are trying to follow the rules of the game for meritocracy. The paper finds that regardless of academic profile, institutions are more likely to enroll students from upper socioeconomic quartile and least likely to enroll Black students in both of the years that I studied. These findings are most pronounced at the most elite institutions, and the relationship reverses when looking at less elite institutions. Namely, similarly qualified lower income students and Black students are more likely to enroll at lower tiered institutions as compared to their more socioeconomically and racially privileged peers. While this intuitively makes sense given what we know in the scholarship about inequities in admission and enrollment, what my findings hone in on is how selective institutions, as it shifts its definition of merit towards more focus on test scores and academic preparation, plays a role in shifting the structure of inequality and excluding specific students from prestigious education. The enrollment management framework provides a pathway for understanding how competing institutional interests can interlock with each other to produce social costs that specifically affect racially and socioeconomically historically excluded students. If higher status groups continue the arms race for more education, higher test scores, and academic preparation, the value of education could follow these higher status students' aspirations. In following their increasing aspirations, selective admissions would structurally exclude a college education, particularly an elite college education, from students from minoritized racial and socioeconomic backgrounds. Even those scholars have found that baccalaureate completion rates increased with institutional selectivity at the national level. Apologies if I'm talking too fast. Born and raised in California, so I have like a very fast-talking voice. So feel free to let me know to slow down, or if you have clarifying questions along the way. But I'll keep most of like the substantive questions for after the presentation, since I kept the presentation short for that. I want to note that I draw from the scholarship that shows the social constructiveness of of merit in undergraduate admissions, the increasing enrollment gaps by racialized and socioeconomic background over the past few decades, and the enrollment management framework. These literatures together illuminate three things. First, not only has merit meant something different throughout the history of higher education, which is something that people often aren't familiar with, but often the definition of merit was fluid and tended to reflect the values and interests of those who have power to impose their particular cultural ideals. There is extensive documentation of this practice, most thoughtfully argued in Jerome Carabelle's tome, The Chosen. So if you haven't read that book, definitely add it to your reading list. I highlight this literature because it shows how merit served as a proxy for the political contestation that was played out by youth over who would constitute the future elite class. The second literature primarily highlights how, as institutions increased their threshold for qualified students in academic profile, they grew to be more reliant on these measures to justify their enrollment and admission decisions. Because rankings were partly based on standardized test levels for enrolled students, standardized testing became more important to institutions and became institutionalized as an objective measure of academic preparation by the public and by many college-ranked institutions. This institutionalization, while helping institutions in the pursuit of their academic profile, resulted in decreasing the accessibility of higher education for lower income students relative to higher income students, thus widening the class and racial gap. As such, these political contestations over power and influence through the shifting definition of merit have increased the impact admission policies and enrollment management had on educational outcomes. Finally, enrollment management, as its own stream of literature, was initially concerned with understanding and developing an infrastructure for managing the growing application pools and subsequent enrollment objectives. It basically started out as a way of more people are applying to colleges. How do we deal with the practical dimensions of those increased academic pools? To this end, and what happened after they created the infrastructure for that, financial aid and admission practices became more intertwined through the formalization of enrollment management units at institutions. financial aid became a powerful strategic tool to attract particular type of students, namely academically qualified students, by discounting their costs through merit aid. But as scholars have shown in studying merit aid, or more closely aligning financial aid with how great your academics were in high school, what we find is that institutions have increased their institutional aid allocations based on merit and relative to how much they give on need. So they're using their financial aid as a way to attract students who already have great academic profiles, not necessarily students who may need the financial aid the most in terms of their lived needs. From these literatures, two major implications emerge. One, as institutions attempt to enroll the most competitive students, if institutions continue to pursue academic profile over access through their financial aid policies, enrollment decisions for funding will be focused on merit terms and not sensitized enough to access concerns. Second, the pursuit of academic profile will produce an ever-increasing threshold for a qualified student over time, suggesting that access carries the least weight in the iron triangle. If you're not familiar with the triangle metaphor, it's you can only do two things and the third one kind of gets left behind. In conjunction with the pursuit of non-resident students as a way to pursue revenue and academic profile, scholars have highlighted that access has decreased to 1, in-state students in states with largely racially minoritized populations, 2, to lower income students, and 3, to students from minoritized racial backgrounds. So the pursuit of academic profile and revenue has led to this threefold trend where people are less likely to get in because institutions are pursuing students with high academic grades and the means to pay for college. In this way, by increasing their selectivity through academic credentials, institutions benefited from choosing highly desirable students and facilitated their access to powerful positions in the political and labor market. In this calculus, the claims that institutions prioritize access for historically excluded students, to me, required interrogation. It just didn't add up. If you're pursuing these other two things, how are you also pursuing this third thing? So I'm not going to spend a whole ton of time, but these are the three hypotheses that will be guiding the findings and the discussion that I'll be talking about. So in combining the literatures that I just discussed through enrollment management, I had these three hypotheses. They follow directly from the literature I've discussed and from other literatures that I'm happy to discuss afterwards. What I will highlight at the moment is that I'm leveraging the individual level data to simulate what would happen in terms of enrollment if these same students had different levels of academic credentials. At its core, my analytical framing hypothesizes that despite academic credentials, structurally advantaged students will continue to enroll at more selective and elite institutions. So I draw from two nationally representative longitudinal data sets to do cross-sectional analyses. What that means is, for those who do not know, longitudinal studies means you follow a certain group of people over time and then you use that representative sample to say something about the life course or about processes over time. When you do cross-sectional analyses, that means that you're taking from two different data sets for one slice of time and using those as comparisons. So I can't say anything about one relative to the other, but I can say about what's going on in those particular times. And then through some simulations, I can actually say how the two times are related to each other and talk about what's going on over time. For this reason, when I discuss the findings, I'll be sure to address the interpretations because I know not everyone is familiar with the types of methods that I'll be using. I focused on students who graduated from high school in 2004 and 2013, so relatively recently, and their first post-secondary institution attended, because we all know that sometimes students will go to one institution and then transfer and things of that sort, but I'm focusing just on their first institution attended. To ensure that samples across both data sets are comparable, only students who did graduate during their 12th grade year were included in the final sample. This approach is consistent with the literature. And analyses, for those of you that care, I did some inverse probability weighting to make sure that everything was nationally representative. So that way when I'm talking about 2004, I'm talking about a sample that is talking about national trends. To handle any item missingness, I also imputed some data, so if you're interested in talking about that, I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. What I do want to draw attention to, just very quickly, is that these are the 4 academic credentials that I'll be talking about later to evaluate the claims of academic profile and meritocracy. I have SAT percentile relative to each year, so what did that 2100 mean in 2004 versus a 2100 when your SAT meant in 2013. and their GPA that's on, like their weighted honors GPA, because I think that more clearly assesses what's going on at the high school level, and their highest math and science GPA. These kind of capture what people say are the most important academic factors that determine who gets into college and where they go to school. For my outcome variable, so this is the thing that I'm actually predicting. So how do these factors that matter, that the literature has shown has matter, predict where students actually go to college? So my outcome variable is defined as a 6-category variable. I first identified whether students did not enroll in post-secondary education, enrolled in a 2-year institution, or enrolled in 4-year. And then I broke apart the 4-year institution by Barron selectivity, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a comparable kind of ranking system with US News, World and Report, but a little bit more tied to the actual what these institutions are doing, whereas US News, World and Report is a little bit more reputationally based. So I used this one because I'm assessing academics, so it made more sense. What this ended up with is a 6-category outcome variable. So I will show you in the next slide. I only focused on these 3 categories because what I'm interested in is how prestige plays a role in all this. But I do have outcomes for these, so if you want to talk about it afterwards, I can definitely talk about it. So basically, I will be discussing the odds of students with different academic profiles enrolling at competitive institutions, very competitive institutions, and most competitive institutions. Because I'm doing regressions, the idea behind that model is that we have factors that we know that explain the variance in where people can end up. So the goal is how many of these relevant and important covariates do we include on the right-hand side of the equation, so that way we're basically catching how much each factor contributes to where the person ends up, in my case. So I used the traditional covariates, which are shown on this slide. Overall, I include demographics, school background, and academic and extracurricular background activities as covariates. Happy to talk about the racial coding. I'm a racial theorist, so doing this type of racial coding was really, really frustrating. So happy to talk about it afterwards. But for now, what's relevant to know is that I broke it down into analyses of 4 racial categories, which included, or I had 5 racial categories in terms of Asian and Pacific Islander, Black, and then multiracial, indigenous, and other racial identities I put together, but I don't actually discuss their findings because I didn't want them to be excluded from analyses because they matter, but also that's not a coherent group of racial identity, so I didn't discuss them in terms of my findings. And then white, and then Latinx was kept as, I used the ethnic coding that it was used in the data set. And as I discussed, these are the 4 academic variables that I'll be talking about in the next slides. So, now the actual findings, now that you know the full background. So the results from my multinomial logistic regression are shown in this table. I will broadly talk about what you should look at from this if you aren't familiar with looking at regression tables. So what these numbers are odds ratios, which means the odds of going to one place. These are the outcomes. So this is the odds of going to the most competitive institution, very competitive, and the competitive. So increasing this way in terms of more prestige. I want to draw, oops, sorry, lost my space. The results are shown here for enrolling at competitive, very competitive, and most competitive institutions relative to not enrolling in post-secondary education. I focus on these particular outcomes because estimates for 2-year or less enrollments and enrollments at non-competitive institutions did not alter the narrative that I was seeing here and that I'll be discussing. And to better understand the relationship between prestige and selectivity and enrollment outcomes, observing these 3 outcome locations provided the most nuanced approach. So the model for these regressions included all the covariates I showed you on the previous slide, but I only show these selected covariates, which are the rows, for those of you that, sorry if you can't read it. It looked like it was legible when I put it together, but now I'm worried that you may not be able to read it. Broadly, what emerges is that large and statistically significant positive estimates for Asian and Pacific Islander students in 2013, the non-significant estimates for Black students in 2013 over here, despite the fact that it was predicted in 2004, and significantly negative estimates for socioeconomic status at all outcomes in 2004 and 2013. So those would be these ones. So when we're looking at these odds ratios, I'm comparing it relative to students from the top SES. So what that means is, for example, this 0.09 means that this student, when controlling for the important other variances and variables, this student from the lowest socioeconomic quartile, the lowest 25%, is about 91% less likely to enroll at the most competitive institution relative to a student from the top SES quartile. So, because while this is important, we can't actually draw any conclusions across models from these types of regressions. I leave that to the next slides that I'll be discussing. That being said, while looking at the odds ratios for 2004 and 2013 in each of these columns, what becomes clear is that students from the lower 75% of the socioeconomic ladder continue to have significantly lower odds of enrolling at selective institutions over not enrolling when compared to students from families in the top 25% of the socioeconomic income level, controlling for all the academic variables and contextual variables that I discussed earlier. In other words, when controlling for factors that traditionally are known to limit access for students with families in the top 25% SES status still have a significantly higher chance of enrolling at more selective institutions relative to them not enrolling in post-secondary education. For the sake of time, I'm going to just move on to the next part, which is intriguing, more exciting to discuss. So as a reminder, the simulations take students, this is a table of probabilities. So this is just, you can look at this probability and just read it as you would any other probability. There's no like relative to or anything like that. So as a reminder, these simulations take students as they are and simply alters the academic level across 4 academic measures in my model. I do this across socioeconomic background and racialized background. So the first slide will talk about the predictive probability of students from different SES backgrounds, and on the next slide will be people from different racialized backgrounds. So table 3, which is shown here, indicates that for students at the 84th percentile, which is this top panel, SES status continued to be predictive of where students would ultimately enroll, since if it weren't predictive, these numbers would be the same. So if SES did not matter in terms of where you end up going, the probabilities should be the same across SES. What we know about income inequality in the United States, it's not surprising that they're not the same, but just so that's one of the very top level findings. So SES continue to be predictive of where students would ultimately enroll, since we don't see equal likelihoods across the table. In 2004, despite having the same academic standing at the 84th national percentile and controlling for other contextual variables, students in the highest SES quartile were most likely to enroll at the most competitive institutions. So if you look at this table, what that means is 42% compared to 19%, and 32% at the competitive and very competitive institutions respectively. So 42 versus the 19 and the 32. In contrast, students from the lowest quartile who had the same academic credentials, that's the key takeaway here, were most likely to enroll at competitive institutions with a 27% likelihood of enrollment compared to 23 and 24% at the top tiers. So that means is looking at 2004s, what you see is that students, when controlling for all other factors, if you're coming from the lowest SES, you have a 27% chance of going to a competitive school or enrolling to a competitive school, 23% here and a 24% here. The important thing in comparing this for students at the top SES is, as you see, it goes from 19 to 32 to 42. So you're seeing as students from the high SES, despite being at the same academic threshold, they're still most likely to go to the most competitive institution, and that same pattern doesn't necessarily hold for students from a lower SES background, despite having the same academic credentials. These socioeconomic gaps hold when moving the academic qualifications to the 91st and 97th percentiles, 91st and 97th national percentiles. The 91st percentile, while students from the lowest socioeconomic quartile were now most likely to enroll at the most competitive institutions with a 40% likelihood, students from the highest quartile had a 56% likelihood of enrolling with the same academic credentials. 56% meaning they're more, once you cross 50%, means you're more likely to get in than not get in, and that's important. This gap essentially holds even at the hypothetical level of being in the top 2% of the nation's academic qualifications. Students from the first quartile are 48% likely to enroll at the most elite institutions, and students from the upper 25% SES status are 62% likely to enroll at the most competitive institutions. That's looking at these numbers. In 2013, despite an overall decrease in likelihood of enrollment at more selective institutions, which you can kind of just tell by the magnitude of likelihood of enrolling at these institutions goes down in 2013 relative to 2004, what also is evident is that the gaps persist that we saw in 2004. Whether at the 91st and 97th academic percentiles, students coming from the top SES status were still more likely to attend the most elite institutions over other types of institutions, while students from the lowest SES status at the same academic levels were more likely to attend competitive institutions. Thus, Table 3 provides evidence for the first hypothesis, if you remember, that at every academic level qualification, students from the highest SES quartile are most likely to enroll at the most selective institutions over students from other quartiles in 2004 and 2013. Moving on to racialized, oh yes.
I just have a quick clarification question.
Sure.
So on the last one, you said like enrolling in that institution. Does that mean that they just didn't get accepted, but they also enrolled in it?
So this has to do with after admission. So so this is because of the framework and the way that it's done, it's controlling for the fact that they got in where they wanted, wherever they got in, and then they made a choice of where they're going to go. So the analyses are talking about controlling for factors that are supposed to explain why they go where they go. What remains is what's attributed to SES, so to speak.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So in Table 4, a similar story emerges for historically excluded communities, most clearly for Black students though. At the 84th academic percentile in 2004, students from all backgrounds were most likely to enroll at either the very competitive or most competitive, with white students least likely to enroll at the most competitive students at this academic level. As expected, the biggest gaps in likelihood of enrollment across racialized background were seen at the most competitive institutions in 2004. As the academic qualifications increased to the 91st and 97th percentile, students across all racialized backgrounds were most likely to attend the most competitive institutions. So far, it sounds like a rosy picture. However, these seemingly egalitarian trends reversed in 2013. While the largest gaps in likelihood of enrollment across racialized background were still predominantly at the most competitive institutions, what became evident is that between 2004 and 2013, the downward shift in likelihood of enrollment at more selective institutions most heavily affected Black students' likelihood of enrollment. So in 2013, while at the 91st academic percentile, Black students were more likely to enroll at very competitive institutions than they were at the most competitive institutions. This is not the case for students of any other racialized background. The narrative at the 97th percentile, while different, suggests that Black students were still most heavily affected by the changes between 2004 and 2013. While Black students were most likely to enroll at the most competitive institutions relative to other levels of selectivity at the 97th percentile, so it's down here, at 31% compared to 27 compared to 24. Sorry, I just want to point it out for you. Black students, yes, 31, 24, and 27. The changes in likelihood of enrollment as they move up selectivity levels were far smaller compared to students of other backgrounds. For example, while at the 97th academic percentile, Black students' likelihood of enrollment by increasing selectivity was 27%, then 24%, and then 31%. It went down 3 percentage points and then up 7 percentage points. In contrast, students from Asian Pacific Islander and white students saw increasing likelihoods of enrollment as institutional selectivity increased. For Asian Pacific Islander students, it was 9% increase and then a 30% increase. And for white students, it was a 5% increase and then a 13-point increase. For Latinx students, while there was a 1 percentage point drop between enrolling at competitive and very competitive institutions with academic qualifications at the 97th percentile, there was a large increase in the likelihood of enrolling at the most competitive institutions compared to the very competitive ones. So you saw an 18 percentage point increase after the 1 percentage point drop. While the general narrative of having the most qualified students enroll at the most selective institutions does occur in 2004 and 2013, and that's good, that's what we want, across racialized background, this should not mask the stepwise inequalities that emerge when viewing these enrollment likelihoods across selectivity. Also, for what it is worth, These stepwise inequalities can also be seen in Table 3. Thus, Table 4 provides evidence for the second hypothesis, but with a caveat. While students from white and Asian Pacific Islander backgrounds had higher odds of enrolling at more elite institutions at every academic level, the gaps between Latinx and white students' likelihood of enrollment were not as severe as initially hypothesized. So while disparities do exist, they emerge most powerfully at the very competitive selective institution when looking at these 3 academic qualification levels. Importantly, what these analyses also reveal is that the system of enrollment management in 2013 was least likely to enroll Black students as institutional selectivity increased, which is what meritocracy would suggest. If you have the best grades, you should be going to the best schools, despite Black students having competitive academic profiles. These findings, combined with the findings in Table 3, provide evidence for my third hypothesis, which is when comparing socioeconomic and racialized disparities between 04 and 13, the greatest changes in enrollment odds were seen at the most elite institutions. So what do we make of all this in the few minutes that we have left? The iron triangle of enrollment management provides a compelling narrative for explaining these findings. As discussed earlier, institutions are increasingly reliant on tuition revenue for their budgets and pursue out-of-state enrollments for this end, while they also pursue competitive academic profiles to maintain their status and prestige level in the field. Pursuing these 2 priorities lessens the pursuit of access for historically excluded communities, both in terms of socioeconomic and in terms of racial background. Through study of individual level enrollment trends in 04 and 13, I was able to bring attention to the precise academic thresholds that elite institutions may use in deciding who to pursue for enrollment. In doing so, when controlling for academic thresholds, students from the highest SES quartile were most likely to enroll at the most competitive institutions in both years. This is not entirely surprising to see, as pursuit of revenue would suggest that institutions aim to enroll wealthy and academically competitive students. Contrary to institutions' appeals to access and equity, though, these same results suggest that institutions do not aim to enroll lower income students, even if they are academically qualified, which is what Table 3 was about. This is a cause for concern because it suggests that even if students from lower SES backgrounds follow the script of meritocracy and produce academically competitive profiles that rival those of students from the highest SES, their likelihoods of enrolling at competitive and the most competitive institutions do not follow the script of meritocracy as it does for their more structurally advantaged peers. And the reason this matters is because scholarship has shown that the returns to an education are most beneficial for students when they come from structurally disadvantaged backgrounds, when they go to more elite institutions. There isn't anything inherently better about going to an elite institution, just a caveat there. And yes, I discussed that. So, while scholarship on funding opportunities provides explanations for why lower SES students may not enroll at more elite and more expensive institutions, what my analyses add to the conversation is that as students from lower SES backgrounds become more academically competitive, these gains are not reflected necessarily in their likelihood of enrollment as they are reflected for their higher SES quartile peers. Through the enrollment management framework, it is not simply a matter of lower SES students not having the funding options to finance higher education, but explicit institutional enrollment management decisions at elite institutions that create the structural situation of meritocracy being available only for the very financially elite. Thus, it is not simply that higher SES students can afford higher education and lower income students cannot. Rather, selective and elite institutions would rather have higher income students relative to lower income students enroll when at the same academic threshold. This is in line with existing scholarship on admission practices, as 2 scholars who did one of the more seminal studies recently found that admission officers are from historically underrepresented backgrounds are more likely to enroll low SES applicants, while admission officers working at their alma mater from more privileged backgrounds were more likely to look favorably on their wealthier students. So in the context of enrollment management, in the context of enrollment likelihoods by racialized background, the narrative was not as straightforward. In 2004, the gaps in enrollment likelihoods across racial background were not as pronounced as they were across SES background. But 2013 indicated a substantive shift. Viewing the changes in likelihood of enrollment between these 2 years by SES and racialized background, combined with the literature suggesting that the effects of the 2008 recession most powerfully affected economically and racially marginalized communities, My findings call attention to how economic and political changes between 04 and 13 affected higher education enrollment, because we had that small thing called the Great Recession, right? Though my analyses are not set up or appropriate to evaluate the effects of the 08 economic recession, my findings highlight that structural changes may have occurred in this time period that partly explain the downward shift in enrollment likelihoods across SES and racialized background. Second to last slide, I promise. Furthermore, viewing these results under the enrollment management framework also suggests that while institutions may not prefer to enroll students from explicit racialized backgrounds, so there isn't this intentional, I don't want these students there, that while institutions may not prefer to enroll students from explicit racialized backgrounds, pursuit of competitive academic profile does not necessarily aid in the pursuit of access. In fact, because institutions are unlikely to shift their pursuit of revenue due to continued state and federal government disinvestment, these analyses suggest that institutions' pursuit of academic profile will necessarily make pursuit of access unfeasible. As academic qualifications increased, as I did through my simulations from the 84th to the 91st to the 97th percentiles, not only were students from socioeconomically excluded communities and backgrounds not as likely to enroll at more selective and competitive institutions, but Black students, and to a lesser degree Latinx students, were also not as likely to enroll at more competitive institutions. Meritocracy then, under the enrollment management framework, does not lead to increased access for historically excluded students. Institutions of higher education must contend with how their competing priorities of pursuing tuition revenue and competitive academic profiles make pursuing access for historically excluded communities a fleeting priority. While this does not mean that institutions are not committed to increasing access for students on campus after they've enrolled, it does mean that increasing access to admissions and enrollment is an untenable goal under existing admission framework. Rather than provide recommendations that do not question the underlying logic and structure of admissions and enrollment, these findings indicate the need for a review of how merit is defined and operationalized. While merit was utilized in this paper as academic credentials, scholars have shown that other factors do influence the ultimate decision of whether scholars are admitted and then pursued for enrollment. These other factors, some of which I included in my paper, I included extracurricular activities, if you remember that, could partly explain the gaps observed in enrollment likelihoods. But altering the value placed on any of these would not, to me, necessarily lead to a reversal in the inequities observed in enrollment trends at selective institutions over the past few decades. I'll conclude with a quote from an important recent publication, which is from a colleague of mine and you should really read. It's in the Pacific Standard, I think. As Nadira Farah-Foley stated in her argument for reconceptualizing merit in admissions, if universities took up this challenge to think of themselves as producers of value, not arbiters of merit, universities could do much more to support marginalized students in applying to college. Accordingly, universities must expand their definitions of merit, and they must also increase their commitment that all students will have the opportunity to prove themselves as meritorious. Because merit has served as a proxy for the political contestation that played out among the youth over who will constitute the future elite class, if these observed inequities are not righted, the most marginalized and historically excluded students will continue to be excluded as the elite work to maintain their status in society. And that is all for me. Thank you so much. I don't know how questioning works, but I know some of you have to leave for classes and things of that sort, so if you have to leave in the middle, feel free to. But I'm here until 1. Questions?